Hey everybody. I got a few directions I'd like to explore in today. But before I get too far into thought, language, ideas, I just want to pause for a moment and listen. To the living place. Whose natures and forms I am absolutely humbled by. Living place whose harmonies follow each other. And if we should look for that which leads them, we might best come up with a few different perspectives rather than one. Our intellects, as moderns, are mechanically oriented or narratively disoriented, or maybe both. Maybe a lot of both. But the thing that stands out primary, blatantly, is the de facto arbiter of synchronization to the mind that sees distinct objects and beings is this: the sun. And in a way, the sun is like the point at the center of the circle of coherence for life on Earth. However, maybe the center of the sphere is better, or maybe a position beyond that. But there are other ways of seeing it, right? That, for example, life on Earth, its anciently evolved harmonies and synchronies and relationships, that these two aspects form a couplet. And I think if we're thinking rationally, it might be difficult to suppose that the incredibly profuse and unimaginably ancient, it's that word again that I like a lot, even though I'm imagining things. I have to imagine things to say unimaginably. See how language works? the profound communion of life on earth is ancient in ways we don't have concepts for yet, but we could develop them so that they become available to our thought and our awareness. And some of us do. In fact, everyone does, to some, degree in some set of domains. But these two primordial aspects can certainly inform each other. However, we might see the sun as sovereign, rationally. And there are many other players. The moon, the history of the universe, the peculiar adventures our planet underwent developmentally and is still undergoing. So I want to listen with my inner being and my ears and my feet, my skin, my eyes, my heart, my dreams. I want to listen to the stories before language gets a hold of them, and feel them. Giant rectangle, amazing trees. I actually feel like kind of a character in a science fiction novel. I was born in the age when science fiction was still young, though there had been older examples. And it was a craze in my childhood, and I read vast quantities of it. And I had dreams of futures. But now we're living something inconceivable to most of us. And so, as individuals and cultures and nations and societies, the humans have fragmented into little groups of factions, each less effective than the next at things that are fundamental, like being human or understanding or meaningful relation or adequate threat awareness, adequate coherence. So by way of listening, when I first entered the gardens today and was reflective, I saw a butterfly, and it was sunning itself on a leaf. And I noticed something peculiar about it. And since I'm aware of bilateral symmetry in animals and how the right and left sides that reach syntropy in the whole, right, in the union, And I think about hemispheric lateralization, the unique natures of the different sides of the human body, from what we have been able to learn, not merely from research, but from being human, and from observing things with care and wonder, and seeing otherwise invisible hints and clues about the big questions and what it means to be human in sidedness. In the dominance of rectitude, the right hand, the side of the body, and I mean this as a parable, not literally, that doesn't have the heart. Now, that side of the body probably has one or two, the right side probably has one or two organs. I'm not a student of anatomy much, that aren't located on the left, maybe the appendix. What I wish to highlight, however, is that the butterfly that I saw, its right wing looked brand new and very healthy. The left wing was broken down, and you could see on the surface of the wing that it was probably not merely the result of misadventure. In other words, it wasn't just that an accident had happened that injured the butterfly's left wing, and in fact, it was capable of flying. It appeared, and I can't be sure of this, that the circulatory system on the left side of that insect's body had been breaking down. And I don't want to ascribe too specific a meaning to that, but rather to just notice it. That the left side of the creature was breaking down. And we might say, well, it is aging, which wouldn't be untrue. And I don't know where the organs are situated in butterflies. In fact, I think insects are unusual. They have exoskeletons. They tend to be pretty goopy inside, to the uneducated observer at least. And again, though I don't wish to collapse this into any specific point, it did occur to me that in our cultures, at least in American culture, there's kind of a tradition, right? If we look back, and it gets murky and it's not perfectly distinct, but there's kind of a tradition that the left side are the visionaries and the dreamers and those who want to help society cohere, and the right side generally, did you notice how I just switched sides there? Is pragmatic, utilitarian, success-driven, progress-driven, financially driven, war-driven. But we're in a weird bardo, a between place right now, where strange kinds of disease and malware have infected what we would usually think of as the people of the vision. Now, of course, there's layers and layers of representation here, right? So there's all these layers where things get abstracted. I don't want to just talk about layers of abstraction. Our societies and our nations abandon relation by building layers of abstraction. And so, too, do they abandon intelligence, syntropy, and superfunction. The potentials that would naturally have emerged as otherwise impossible actual advancements get represented, codified, financialized, incentivized by non-being, right? Incentivized by absence of being together, and then presented as togetherness. What a shock. So the processes that rob us of synergy and syntropy and synchronization and coherence, these always present perennially as heroic and advanced, though I'd love to see what meaning we would actually associate with that in the modern situation. And we represent features of our humanity and intelligence, personal and collective, of our organismal nature, our animaliality, our not merely physical, so I'm going to say proto-physical rather than metaphysical, right? Before the physical, right? And all of this gets represented, and we get religions and corporations and governments and wars and bizarre technological advances that are not only meaningless in the sense that they produce the common opposite of their promises, still representing as heroic, right? We're going to connect everybody. How did that work out? So our species is driven by these habits and their traditions too. And they wiped out the old traditions because they're extremely fit for competition in an environment where there's unlimited resources. If you have unlimited resources, you can do incredibly insane things all day long and survive them. Now, it's only certain kinds of insane things that you can get away with doing if you want to survive. But that field is nearly inexhaustible. You can keep finding new insane things to do because you can just burn unimaginable resources in any direction that some collective happens to decide might grant it competitive advantage, because all of these representations are actually competing against each other for dominance. And we are the inaction bodies of that process. Human beings. We have become literally possessed. And trust me when I say this, it makes no difference whatsoever in the outcome for us and our experience and for life on Earth, whether we are possessed by a demon or by a delusion. Works out about the same. And in case it isn't clear, most of the stuff our people are possessed by produces results that they pretty much look demonic. Now I'm going to ask that we not collapse that frame, right? We're not going to say like, is it spiritually evil? I think fundamentally it does matter if what we mean by spiritual authentically refers to proto-physical, to the layer of inexplicable mystery and monumental potency that underlies the existence of beings like those on Earth and like ourselves, all of which are expressions of something beyond mere love. The love is involved. They're expressions of communion, which is a process we might visualize as beginning at unity, descending into diversity, from there descending into physical embodiment in distinct organisms and relationships, and from that position moving back up the ladder, right, to unify within the physical what began as unity in the proto-physical, right? Reunion, communion, awareness, actually it didn't begin as unity, it began as something far weirder that we have no good language about. I mean, I'm trying to think of some way to speak toward it meaningfully. It's not mere unity. It's explosively, mysteriously intelligent. It's beyond alive. So reunion is the experience, while embodied, of not thinking about what I'm talking about, but the direct experience of it, as when I saw the butterfly's wing. For a very tiny example, there are much bigger ones I could give, but that wing, the left side, it was dying. And there's this old story, there's many old stories, where the right side attacks the left side and kills it, thus banishing it to what we might call the underworld, which could be the proto-physical, right? The before of the physical. A dreaming place. The land of the dead. There are many such stories like this, and one of the things that's going on as the individuals and societies and groups now present on Earth for the science friction cascade we're currently engaged in is that the left side is undergoing a conversion, a damaging conversion to artifact, abstraction, semantics. Language and conception and representation are now invading the dreaming aspect of our people, and there's some crossover there in our ridiculously abstracted political system here in the United States that's mostly just a clusterfuck of malware. A clusterfuck of bad programs that are being run primarily for power and profit in a time when it's never been more necessary that something else obtain. That something noble and true become not just the goal of those we elect, but the necessary precondition of our potential to form intelligent, meaningful society together, with and for each other, with and for the history and future of life on our planet. And those who say, well, life's not in danger, good for you. You know, life will bounce back. Really? Did you feel that way when you lost your parents or your grandparents? Did you feel like, well, I'll just bounce back? Nature's really resilient. She can take whatever we can throw at her. We are nature, and we are fragile. And the environment of this planet, as paradisically over-endowed as it has been, and still to some degree remains, is fragile. Abstractions and generalizations of the resilience of the environment are insane. Because they are promoted to defend deflection. Well, we don't really have to be concerned about that. That stuff will all bounce back. Really? Well, imagine that you had the same perspective on the organs in your body. Well, I can just sell my kidneys, they'll bounce back eventually. Who needs lungs? The heart's good enough, it can do the work of all the other organs. You wouldn't last a microsecond if actual decisions were made according to that logic. But what I want to say is just that the environment is much more fragile than we imagine. And if we wipe everything out, you know, we can't say in the future whether or not life will reemerge on this world. What we can say is that the anciently preserved ecologies, with their unimaginable intelligence and profound symbiotic communion, the birthplace of our bodies and intelligences, will have been sacrificed for a series of abstract illusions that are meaningless except for their incredible virulence and potential to propagate in human minds. There's no scenario where that turns out well for anything, including the sun. Because somehow our world is not merely one of the organs of the sun. It's probably the only one with physically embodied minds. And something else we don't have a word for, which is the likeness or the metaposition of minds in living places, animals, plants, insects, fish, birds. And what I speak of here is something our distant ancestors were aware of, and it made them ecstatic, and they were filled with awe and reverence. And it wasn't because they were superstitious. Perhaps as their societies collapsed, superstition became an abstraction floating on the top of that. But originally, this young hawk on the ground. It's hard to see. Just pausing to listen for a moment. When I see that hawk move and fly, I see a language older than time as we think about it. I see embodied intelligence. And I'm reassured. I know how bad things can get, so when I see a tree, I feel so privileged to even just see one tree or one bird, because I live in the phase of life on Earth where this lives with me. And I strive to live for the living beings and places. Though like all of us, I'm human, I have habits and desires and confusion and fear, thoughts. And I'm enmeshed in contexts that even if I'm quite agile and attentive, which I'm not, would still constrain me, because the capacity for synchronization, for syntony, is limited. I'm enmeshed in a war zone of different noise-making representational constructs, physical and non. And they are profoundly compelling to nearly everyone. So there's incredible decoherence, disharmony. Dystonia, suffering. In my last video, I was trying to talk about the necessity of having coherent temporal and relational space in which to understand and explore and develop, to discover, to recover the faculties and potentials innate in human beings. And while I was attempting to pursue that topic, because I forgot to turn on airplane mode on my phone, it's kind of interesting. Airplane mode lets you go above the local noise floor. I kept getting signals and interruptions, and so I had a little trouble. But I was trying to highlight the difference between a life in which that coherent space is broken up at different levels by obligations, tasks, notifications, emails, phone calls, letters, bills, illness, unnecessary illness particularly, and injury, so that we never actually settle into a temporality, right? A tempo, a pace that's coherent and supports our humanity and our intelligence and our creativity and our hearts, our emotionality, that supports awareness and active sensing, right? Sensing, that's the kind of thing we see going on in, for example, the instant-to-instant behavior of a sports team. Right? None of them know what they're going to do. They have an array of shared goals and habits. And novelty is brought in, and the teams compete. And in fact, one could say the teams partially invent the novelty and are invested in that novelty, because if everything just came off like a set of rules, games would be unimaginably boring, unimaginably quickly. Oh, I'm going to reduce my use of this word. I've become aware that I keep hyperbolizing this way. And many games are kind of boring anyway because they're representations of heroism rather than actual heroism. And it's the actual heroism I'm pretty interested in. And we might notice that it's not uncommon for humans to collapse toward unity of some kind in a crisis that affects them all. When there's a threat that affects everyone, humans do the weird thing we used to be. They cohere. They reunite. And you could see this like if there's an earthquake, right? You'll see both sides of the humans. You'll see opportunists, right? Some of them. But you'll see other people transform immediately into people who will risk their lives to save their neighbors. Neighbors that might actually be unknown to them. Which is a really weird modern idea. How could you have a neighbor that's unknown to you? See how common that is, though? How much more so are the living places unknown to most moderns? They're not your neighbor, they're your body. Or you're their body, or something, or both, and more. And so it's not uncommon that with a certain kind of crisis, the humans, it becomes a syntropy attractor. And in such situations, the humans achieve superfunction in a way that is represented by the actions of those we consider to be sports heroes. So again, you can see the process of offloading actual faculties, intelligence, potential into abstractions, and then representing them, and then playing them out. And I find it fascinating that this is so incredibly compelling that you can get 100,000 people together in a stadium, absolutely ecstatic over the fact that 3 guys moved a ball 20 yards. And the looks on their faces are they're the look that you'd see if someone suddenly caught a glimpse of the divine, or the layer of the proto-physical. But what they're seeing, it may be partly divine in the sense that they're seeing the echo of the otherwise impossible superfunction that happens when diverse people, each one unique, unify around a goal they're absolutely passionately engaged with. What would it be like if we could do that together a lot of the time with goals that weren't representations, but were truly noble and humane and creative and intelligent, reverential, awe-inspiring? I think that's a life many people would defect to. If we could establish a context, anything that even vaguely resembles that, I think there'd be a massive emigration from game A into an infinite game. One that isn't, like, if there's competition in that kind of game, it's competition for mutual superfunction, right? It's competition towards syntropy. I mistakenly used the word syntony earlier because I forgot the word I was looking for. And what you're witnessing right now is a very localized, personal example of that. So, on a podcast I was listening to earlier, I think a guy named Jordan mentioned the idea of those who speak only when spoken through, which means the voice of the collective of life on earth and humanity is alive in someone, and they are in service to that. They make face noises and write things and stuff. And that's a form. See, what I'm trying to say is that it's not my mind that speaks, even though my mind forms my words and chooses my path and my reflections. The history of life on earth speaks. When we speak meaningfully and truthfully with great earnestness and sincerity, there's space, there's coherence. For something far beyond us to speak within us first and move our hearts to speak into the physical world. Now that guideline's a little bit perhaps too concrete a translation of its origin, right? Speak only when spoken to. for us to have the opportunity to discover and recover and invent the most beautiful and profound aspects of the field of our human potential, which is many-layered and extraordinary, far beyond our thought and ideas, far beyond our accomplishments. We have to have coherence. Whether one is working alone or one is engaged in endeavors on their own, or whether we are together. In both cases, we need temporal coherence, relational coherence, ecological coherence, and particularly the integrity that allows us to be safe if we establish the space in which our endeavors will come to life, and it is kept sacred in the sense of not being constantly violated by noise and bizarre representational obligations and things like this. We need space. And I think many people suspect that if they had enough money, they'd have enough space. And it could work out in some cases. But that coherence can't really be purchased, even though you can use the money to defect from the noise to some degree. Right? You can buy a yacht for the moment, go out and live on the ocean, hope you're good against pirates. You can buy an island or whatever, whatever the defense is. But us ordinary people are struggling because the space in which we have to form awareness and intention, purposive orientation, perspective, is constantly being recursively intruded by all kinds of representations, by this swarming mass, myriad of representations and obligations and, abstract relationships. And in order to have the opportunity for coherent endeavor space, I think we need each other. I think we have to form, and there's a way that's totally natural that humans are brilliant at this. We need to form little syntropy attractors that become contexts that preserve coherence, the possibility of synchrony, harmony. Because the contexts in which we are enmeshed and to which we are exposed, the buffer between our interiority and the intrusiveness of all of this has been getting shredded for the past 100 years at least, very significantly in that time. And there's not much left of it. And it's interesting to notice that in the current situations that face our people and nations, societies, cultures, and so on, it's really just been falling down a mountainside for a long time, longer in some places than in others. But wherever the kind of colonialist ethic of dominate, destroy, wear the hero's costume, obliterate the world, torture the people, but give them lots of stuff while you're torturing them. Lots of meaningless stuff. Wherever that game's going on, the integrity even of that game itself, which for a long time was a good competitor, hard to outcompete, until, as others have said, it met itself and had to compete against others, using the same frameworks. And not compete for mutual benefit, compete for dominance, right? Everyone wants to be on top. Maybe that's when you get coherent. Maybe in the representation, that's when you're supposed to inherit this sort of heaven of coherent, spacious liberty. Doesn't work out much that way. Our own bodies are they are parables. They're embodied parables of how synchrony and coherence and mutual altruistic endeavor emerge as first basic physical superfunction, but then other layers of potential superfunction, particularly in union with other animals like ourselves, for purposes that are actually noble. And we don't have to be too severe in our definition of nobility. We can be very modest. We can say something like, whenever we become less wrong together with and for each other, that qualifies as nobility. When we learn to make truthful, heartful, compassionate sense, intelligent sense together. And then when we enact those insights together in our behavior, in our relations, in our priorities, and the purposes which we attend, then that's noble, right? We can have a general guideline. It doesn't have to collapse into law. And by the time it does, we're in trouble. Once it has to collapse into actual abstract representations, the game of courtrooms, that's a sign that we were fucked a long time ago. We managed, as a species, to accelerate our growth and technology so rapidly that the stuff we call resources, which are actually living places and beings that get massacred to produce product and profit, those are now finite. Previously, in a previous episode, mankind was too small to obliterate the organs of the earth which create homeostatic coherence so that you can survive weather changes and things like this. In a previous episode, before the onset of industrial technology, we were still capable of doing a lot of damage, apparently. From what we know, the early humans on the various continents pretty much took out the megafauna, the big animals. So even back then we were a threat. But we didn't have the capacity to, for example, kill the ocean or, pave the Amazon rainforest. Now we're past that. We've really deeply damaged the ecologies on which our survival depends. At the moment of highest human population in history, and something very few people talk about, object and machine proliferation. And those objects and machines are symptoms, they're the physical symptoms of a disease, right? A cognitive disease, a relational disease, maybe even a religious disease, a constellated family of diseases that are the result of our representational inheritance and the capacity to defect from relation into abstraction. And this catastrophe is not creating a Syntropy well in our country. It's having the opposite effect, right? Rather than recognizing, oh, there's a library of active threats, many of which are of our own creation, that we have to address together immediately. In fact, we're far too late at addressing them than we should be. Instead of that bringing us together and causing us to establish trustworthy, sincere, authentic, intelligent institutions and maybe something like the opposite of corporations as they presently exist, we are fragmenting and dumping power into sidedness, competition for dominance, competition for winning, a kind of apocalyptic competition for the, it is an apocalyptic composition. Every player for themselves at any cost kind of game. And this is an absolutely lethal moment for our species to fall further down that mountainside, and for any group of humans to fall further down that mountainside. There's nothing in that direction in that direction lies oblivion. In that direction lies horrifying chaos. And many of us are kind of spoiled, or maybe even extremely spoiled, in that we've never seen fields of dead bodies. But we've certainly seen fields of dead minds and vast landscapes of dead time invading what might have been meaningful experiences of human interiority. There's a small population of humans who, whether or not they can articulate what I'm reflecting on the same way, they are deeply aware of what I'm talking about, and even the common humans can sense, holy shit, this isn't gonna work, right? Like, this just straight up isn't gonna work. This being modernity, game A. Every faction for themselves at any cost. Because any cost these days can easily become all costs. And I'm encouraged at the possibility that a crisis like this can produce intentional human syntropy and superfunction and awakening. But I'm not terribly optimistic. I only notice, there's an opportunity here. It's conceivable that some group of people will move in that direction, or that some groups of people will move in that direction together, intelligently, and learn how to forge the positions that lie far above our cultures of abstraction, identification, projection, transference, lying, violation, harm. There's a situation in which one has gone too far to turn around. And the temporal pulse has changed suddenly, so that we're like a cartoon character that runs off the edge of a cliff and keeps running, right? And then suddenly looks at the camera and goes like, "Whoa!" and falls down to the crevasse. The coyote or whatever, Elmer Fudd maybe. There's a point of no return for human hubris. And there are also steps in that process toward the point of absolutely no return. And I'm not sure at all. I feel quite concerned that our species has been playing that game now in ever accelerated little bubbles at the same time, right? For so long that we've passed all point of return. And what that means is we will become extinct. And if that happens, if we don't turn toward our potential to avert apocalypse, the real big thing, not just for humans, then everything that we ever did, we will change the entire meaning of the past of life on Earth. So we have, as human beings, the capacity to ennoble the history of life on Earth and of our people, the history of the Earth, by becoming beautiful together. But we also have the capacity to end that entire story with a tragedy that was completely unnecessary and born of insane delusions of power and dominance and abstraction and representation, and our catastrophic vulnerability to and addiction to these aspects which really comprise very low rungs on the ladder of our potential. You see, there won't be anything noble about science or philosophy or creativity if we crash the vehicle we made them in support of. Particularly if we allow the vehicle to be the vehicle of humanity, right? The vehicle of our history, the vehicle of the history of life on Earth. Particularly if we allow pirates and rapists and insane people to force that vehicle to crash on purpose. For egoic reasons, for reasons related to the acquisition of dominance or power in an attempt to win something that was never a competition until we made it one on purpose. And that's the situation we're in right now. At least here in the United States, the commander-in-chief is this kind of maniac. And he's replaced many of the organs in the admittedly festering institutions of what we optimistically refer to as our nation. He's just wholesale gutted. And again, many of these institutions were, and will continue to be completely corrupt, right? These institutions suck. They don't do what, they're like pretend heroes, occasionally accomplishing some minor good while imposing, catastrophe wherever they don't do that, and pretending otherwise. So, but we're in a situation like that. We're in free fall, and because our methods of assembling institutions in government are so corrupted as to have just been turned into literal malware, we can't, by merely voting, affect that crisis. And I've had people come and say, well, this is really depressing, Darren. You've got a really grim view. And it's not entirely untrue. I'm fairly pessimistic, but not only. And yet, as human beings, we live in an interval of time. Our lifetime is one interval, and the times in which that lifetime takes place, these two aspects become married. And perhaps, well, not perhaps, in a crisis there are many opportunities for astonishingly meaningful roles, endeavors, learning and growth, even if the crisis leads off a cliff. And we know this for a simple, easily understood reason. Our lives are thus. They're not infinite, they're finite. And eventually, the cells of the body age, we lose resilience, we grow old, and someday we die. But the fact that we die enhances the meaningfulness of life rather than detracting from it. And so in a time of crisis, transformation, decoherence, fragmentation, we have new opportunities for roles that would otherwise never occur to us, or our common obligations would prohibit. And this gives me some hope as well. And there's another thing that gives me hope. And this is kind of a big secret, but it's well known from history. a very small group of intelligent, aware, committed, sincere individuals, say 2 groups of 30 of them, can transform a nation overnight. We have the capacity for tactical intelligence as human beings that's way beyond anything we're used to seeing or imagining. And sports teams, again, are a representation of this. And that's part of why people go nuts when they score a goal, or don't. Small, tightly knit groups of highly motivated, intelligent people can directly manipulate the very accessible pivots on which the entire superstructure of lies is founded. And that thing can crumble in a week. And this is kind of a secret weapon in nature's arsenal, in human nature's arsenal. Except it's not an arsenal, it's a toy box. In case you don't believe me, it's really easy to see how... It's easy to see the dark side of this, right? 10 people totally committed to a project of destruction can change the course of a nation's history in a single day. But similarly, that same property holds on the other wing: mutual uplift, active sensing, tactical intelligence, noble endeavor. And I imagine the emergence of something resembling civilian intelligence teams that are so profoundly endowed and familiar with the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of representational culture that they can foment an invisible revolution with no or nearly no violence. And this can happen very quickly. We're really good at building and training small, tightly knit teams for impossible missions. And right now, there's a forest of such missions waiting for those teams. It remains to be seen whether or not we can enter that space together and begin to fulfill some of the opportunities and responsibilities inherent both in our human nature and in the moment at hand. But I am convinced that goal is achievable, and it's multi-achievable. And groups and teams like this can link together for mutual benefit, intelligence, defense, success. I know this is reachable. I've seen it on small timescales. I've been involved in it on small timescales with small groups. And it always struck me as astounding that this hadn't caught on like wildfire. Well, maybe it was waiting for the perfect storm. And if it was waiting, now is that time. Though, you know, a year from now could be more that time. And I hope that we'll do something like this before crisis forces our hand. Because by that time, we'll be under pressure. Yeah? And right now, we could do it without a lot of pressure. But in crisis, we will obey the tempo of the threats that we encounter. And that path has fewer degrees of freedom. Like the owls and raptors and crows, ravens choose trees to nest in. We must choose frames together that are flexible, intelligent, conducive to our own awareness, our presence, our dreams. There is no perfect framework. There are those that are less wrong. And there are some that lift us above the frame collapses of history and habit and return degrees of liberty, degrees of freedom to us in thought and relation, endeavor. May we learn to seek those and invent them and embody them together.